Well, good afternoon, brothers and sisters, young people and friends. If you've been looking at the screen for the last few minutes, you might have noticed there's a trembling going on. I thought that was kind of interesting, wasn't it? In the light of verse 20, that all the men upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence. Well, we'll just take the power cord out. I think that takes care of the trembling. And we should be able to just look at this without trembling, because really we want to pay attention to this chapter. And I particularly wanted Ezekiel 38 to be read, because as far back as I can remember in my childhood, my parents being Christadelphians, this was the chapter, Ezekiel 38. And brethren came to us who were old enough to be my granddad, and they would always take Ezekiel 38. They'd go through the same thing. And Dad would go through the same thing. And now I'm going through the same thing. And my children are going through the same thing. And the grandchildren are now going through the same thing. We always go to Ezekiel 38. So it's something we should never tire of. And it's something we really need to pay attention to. This address will be light on how, but it will be heavy on why. Light on how, because I think, as you'll see as we go through this address, that you have to be very careful if you're going to try to tell yourself or show to other people how this will happen. But we certainly know why it will happen. And so I want to just progress on that point. Now, brothers and sisters, we must admit that we are very privileged. There was a generation, and there may be some people still alive who could say they, at the beginning, did not see the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem being changed from the centuries of time when the Jewish people were in captivity. But there's just a few of them, because almost every one of us that are here today has seen this happen, or it's happened just prior to our birth. Behold, as Joel says in chapter 3, behold in those days and in that time when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. Tel Aviv, from sand dunes to a major city in 100 years. So what we are seeing, quite apart from all the generations who read chapter 38 and did not see, we are seeing these things being fulfilled before our eyes. That puts us in a very privileged position, and it puts us in a position of having to make sure we live accordingly. But that has been one of the most wonderful passages, Joel 3, verses 1 and 2. Because you see, after he says, I will gather again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations. And that's one of the things we see happening today, is all nations troubled, trembling because of what's happening in the earth. Things happening every day, and new things happening, so that, I've been watching the news this morning just to try to make sure I hadn't missed anything overnight. That's the world we live in. There's just amazing things happening. But again, in Ezekiel 38, verse 8, it's not that we have to go to Joel. It says it here in this verse 8, that after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely out of them. Now, this is not the only two passages. These other passages all focus on this one event, that these people are going to be called back to the land of Israel, and when that happens, these other things can also happen. Now, you see, Ezekiel 38 doesn't require us to do a whole lot of research, because anyone who's read the Bible will know that you're reading names that have occurred in some other place in the Bible. That's the great advantage that Bible students have over people who maybe open the Bible for the first time at Ezekiel 38. Say, well, how can you make out of these verses what you're saying? Well, it's because in Genesis 10, we see those names. Gomer and Magog and Tubal and Meshech and Gomer and Togarmah and add others as we go through the chapter. And these are the sons of Japheth. That maps, these ancient maps that we find, and certainly maps of people who have tried to study where peoples migrated to, are almost all talking about the north of Israel. And the Bible stresses this idea of it's the north. They come from the north. Well, if you take a line from Israel and you go north, you almost go right through Moscow. And so it's something that you can see very clearly if we just pay a little attention to small details. But when we come to, say, an atlas like Rand McNally, and you see a little note up here, you can see at the top of your screen, the descendants of Gomer occupied probably Germany, France, Spain, and the British Isles, that we're not straining things. We're not giving some unique interpretation. It's not as if these things were in doubt and there was a whole lot of question about it. That's where these people were. They lived in Europe. They lived north of Israel. And so Gomer and Magog and Rosh and Meshech and Tubal, they're nations up north of Israel. Now notice this, and this is one of the key things I think that Ezekiel 38 tells us. We don't go to the news and say, well, look what's happening, and then come to our Bible and say, no, where does it say that would happen? That's not the way we go at this. It's not the way John Thomas did it, who was trying to interpret this before Israel was back in the land. He noticed in Ezekiel 38, verse 4, it says, I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws. I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. It's not looking at history and say, well, this is going to happen someday, and we just have to wait till circumstances bring it forth. Well, God's telling us, this is his work. I will turn thee back. I will bring thee forth. And so we might not see anything immediately leading up to it, but we do expect that God will do these things, and certainly it will come to pass. Again, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. It's not just God saying, well, there's going to be a kingdom sometime in the future. He's saying in the days of these kings, God will intervene. And the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Or in Zechariah 14, verses 1 to 3, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished. Half of the city will go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. So from these passages, we can see that what we are expecting is God's intervention to do these things which his word says will happen. And coming back to Joel, just reinforce again that it said that in both those verses, that I will bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, and I will gather all the nations. Now that should have a special ring to Christadelphians, because Christadelphians understand the name of God to be Yahweh. And we have learned through the writings of our pioneers that that name refers to the future, I will be. But when we see it laid out in the Old Testament, where God uses his name, he always tells us what he will do. So you can see God plays upon his name. It's not just I, it's Yahweh that will do this, because he is the one who will do these things. And as a result, that becomes sort of a fingerprint of God through the scriptures. Now, we've been through this. Any research will illustrate that certainly there's a large area of agreement that the word chief in the Old Testament King James Version should be Rosh, a proper name of a people of which we have been able to identify the Russians. John Thomas said this, and this is an interesting idea that he puts forth here in Help Us Israel. He says, in identifying Gog of the land of Magog, that is, styling the ruler of Magog by the latter syllable of the name of the country over which he rules. We have seen that Magog is the region extending from the Rus, or Russia, to the Rhine, comprehending Wallachia, Transylvania, Hungary, and Germany. Of course, the prophecy must be future, because the prince of the Rus is the Gog of Magog, and as yet no emperor of Russia has been also emperor of Germany. So you see, when you look at how these things are going to come to pass, and even what the Bible itself says, you have to be true to what it says. That this Gog of the land of Magog must be an emperor who was linking Russia and Germany. And many people have seen in times past what they thought would likely be this link, but yet we still wait to see that link, however it will come to pass. He goes on to talk about Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarter and all his bands. Many peoples of Europe with Russia is really what that's saying to us. And then, of course, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. And you will see, I feel certain that as we go through all our talks today, you'll see these other nations mentioned in more detail. So, in just a summary of those few verses of Ezekiel 38, 2-7, this is what John Thomas went on to say in Help Us Israel. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the emperor of Germany, Hungary, etc., the autocrat of Russia, Muscovy, and Tobolsky, and prophesy against him and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, autocrat of Russia, Muscovy, and Tobolsky, and I will turn thee about and put a bit in thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth from the north parts, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them, crowded with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords, among whom shall be Persians, Ethiopians, Libyans, all of them with shields and helmet, French and Italians, etc., Circassians, Cossacks, and the Tartar hordes of Uzbek, etc., many people, not particularly named besides. Be thou prepared, prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled with thee, and be thou imperial chief to them. So in being more particular, even though we see a lot more than John Thomas saw, he was reading what he could make out of Genesis 10, Ezekiel 38, and as a result, he mentioned all of those names of nations. Yes, I think you can see that a little easier today. The idea in verse 7 of Ezekiel 38, be thou prepared, prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, be thou a guard unto them. And Russia seems to be going out of its way to illustrate they are going to protect their citizens. It's interesting just to see where Russian citizens are, not the least of which is Israel itself, for the number of Russians that have come from Russia to Israel, so that it's a significant part of the Russian population. If they really had this policy intact everywhere, we might see a lot more of those kinds of missiles protecting their citizens. Now that there's some work to be done on this is obvious from this rather recent map of NATO and Europe. So the blue countries are the NATO countries, and you can see, if you certainly can remember back to the Warsaw Division of Europe, that NATO nations now reach far more into Eastern Europe and towards Russia, and that this has become quite a sore point for Russia to have to deal with the fact that these nations on the western border of their nation used to be Warsaw Pact countries. We've got a lot of movement to see there, but we never know how long it's going to take. And we have for years thought that this could happen very quickly because of just the ability of the Russian nation and the hostility of the Russian nation towards its enemies. If you can remember back to 1957, well, some of you will remember that, and certainly remember that headline, though it may not have been that in your paper. It's here. The Soviet fires Earth satellite into space. It's circling the globe at 18,000 miles per hour. The sphere tracked in 4 crossings over the US. Well, American citizens and the American government sort of went wild at this, because in the 50s there were these huge bombs and missiles being developed. And to think that some foreign nation, hostile nation, could send a little thing right over top of your country and you couldn't do anything about it, started a lot of things, not the least of which was going to the moon in '69. So we've seen rather spectacular things happen rather suddenly, and we've noticed what has taken place in reaction to them. I can well remember the significance of this. Like, when you get a bomb that's 100 times bigger than Hiroshima, the one dropped in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and they say, well, we have enough bombs to kill everybody in the world many times over, you see the madness of it. And that's where the idea of mad came from, is that this is absolutely madness to ever have weapons like this. But that's the world we live in. And not only is the world we live in, it's interesting how many times Putin has raised this issue recently, that he has nuclear weapons, and that if they were pushed, they would use them. So it's not as if, it's a thing of the past. We don't have to concern ourselves anymore about it. This was a major concern to the Americans, not so much to the Canadians, but certainly to the Americans, when Khrushchev decided that he was going to send his missile boats to Cuba and establish just on the southern fringe of the United States a group of hostile missiles. And you can see the plan there they had to intercept them. And fortunately, I suppose, the Russians decided maybe the best thing would be just go home. And they did. Now, this is an indication of how we saw this in the 60s. This was a chart that was painted in Australia here. It was a chart I had in my use during the Six-Day War, 1967. In that Six-Day War, we were in Queensland. We were using this chart, and we were trying to illustrate those points to the audience. It was exciting times. I don't think I've ever had any time or an opportunity to speak that was so exciting as it was during the Six-Day War, to be talking on that to a public audience. And of course, we didn't know initially what was going to happen as to whether Israel was even still there, because the original and initial ideas coming out of Egypt, which was just plain propaganda, was that they had significantly entered into Israeli space and were beating the Israelis back, only to try to get Jordan into the war, until finally we, somewhere during that week, we heard that no, it was the very reverse of this, that Israel had sent their air force to knock out many of the airplanes and the defenses of Egypt at the very beginning of the war. A very different thing. But it was an exciting time. Now, that's what we said. That was, you really agree with everything that you can see on there or not. That was the chart that we were using, and it was just typical of the charts. If you looked at what we were saying about Russia, it was Russia advances to world conquest, increasing communist peril challenges the West, 23 wars against the Reds in 20 years since World War II, 1,000 million held under communism, domination of a quarter of the world's land area, 20-year average of 1 million enslaved each week. Reds believe they will conquer the world in 20 years. Massive stockpiling of terrifying war weapons. Coming Russian invasion of Israel will plunge all nations into World War III. And same passages. When we went down into parks in Toronto, in Allen Gardens in particular, And we didn't use that particular chart, but we went down with those ideas. We had an audience. You could go down into the park in the 60s, and it was a place where anybody was allowed to speak between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, something like your Sydney domain. And people would be there by the hundreds. It's just a matter of trying to interest them enough to stay with you, but there would be hundreds of people there. People with their Bibles. People could tell you a little bit about their Bibles, but not anymore. They don't know enough about their Bibles to even be aware of these things. So it's a very different world. In the 70s, now you might know those two brethren. Brother Maury Stewart on the left, and Brother Perce Mansfield on the right. And that was just Maury's set that he went on television with. Program was called This Is Your Bible. And he always had that in his background on all his television programs. So you can see the same message through the 70s. And it was an exciting time to live. But then the Berlin Wall came down. And we never expected it to be like that. We never thought it would be peaceful. We never thought that East and West Germany would come together like they did. We thought it would be with guns, it would be with conquest. So it was something new for us to see this. The Soviet Union collapsed the next year. And you can see the things that happened we would never have thought of. That the Warsaw Pact would just fall apart, and that there wouldn't be any warfare involved in some cases. In some cases there was, and a number of cases there wasn't. And this man, Mikhail Gorbachev, man of the year, as far as time is concerned. But it's different now, brothers and sisters. And for those people who were measuring their ideas of prophecy by what the world was showing them, rather than what the Bible said, they lost sight of Russia for a while. I don't know whether some of them ever came back and they thought that maybe we'd got the wrong nation here. Maybe it was somebody else that was being mentioned. But no, we've lived through this. And now we see Russia coming back. It's the same spirit, this idea of conquest. This new prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, who loves to have pictures like that taken of him and flashed around the world as if people didn't think enough of him, so it had to be put in gold framing. And then the invasion and the takeover of Crimea. Like, we've witnessed this. We've seen this nation at work, denying all the time that they're involved at all, yet clearly observable with satellites, that's where the nation or where the armament came from, and the patterns that they had on, and trying to make sure that they could take full control of Crimea. We saw the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 blasted into the sky. No claim. In fact, Russia won't even allow United Nations to investigate. That's the spirit of the nation that has risen in the place of the former Soviet Union. And no doubt about how that crashed. When you see the shrapnel that went in the cockpit of the plane, that there was a missile that brought it down. Now, I thought you might just enjoy a little bit of this, because this illustrates a few other things that I think came out of the news just this week. It's been in the news in Canada for quite a long time because we have to deal with the Arctic. But notice what it says. Russia says it has submitted to the United Nations a bid for vast territories in the Arctic Ocean. The Foreign Ministry said on August 4th, that's this year, that Moscow is claiming 1.2 million square kilometers of the Arctic sea shelf. Russia, the United States, Norway, Denmark, and Canada have all attempted to assert their jurisdiction over parts of the Arctic Ocean, which is thought to hold much of the Earth's undiscovered energy resources. Russia first submitted such a claim in 2002, but the UN returned it due to a lack of evidence. Moscow's latest bid reportedly contains much more data. Russia made a symbolic claim to the Arctic seabed in 2007 when one of its submarines dropped a canister containing a Russian flag on the ocean floor near the North Pole. Well, that's not the way it was reported in 2007. It was a Russian robotic submarine that placed the Russian flag under the sea at the North Pole. Now, the North Pole is not that close to Russia, so it's obviously an intention to illustrate to the nations, this is ours, regardless of what you think or how it might be claimed or settled at United Nations. That's the spirit of the nation. These aircraft, Canada is constantly having to deal with these aircraft that come from some of the far north air bases that Russia operates. These are bombers, they're military aircraft. And the interesting thing is the cheek of the nation is to come down to United States Californian airspace. That's a long way from Russia. They had to have a fuel tanker aircraft to allow them to go that far, but just to, well, you know, to salute the United States on July 4th, which is their wonderful weekend. And that's the way the Russians are, certainly in the world today. Well, we're not too interested in the way they are today. We just wanted to have a look a little bit again at this passage, because God says, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, from Zechariah 14. And so however we see Russia and Europe coming together, the object is to gather the nations to be against Jerusalem. It's not just to bring them together. So if you were to go to Jerusalem, and Sister Dorothy and I did this just for one of our anniversaries, we thought we'd go to Israel, we just rent a car, drive around, and have a look at what interest Russia has in the city of Jerusalem. Why would Russia be drawn to Jerusalem? Why would Europe and Russia come together against Jerusalem? Well, there's a picture of the old city, and you can see it's fairly well inhabited, the area. But there's obviously a Latin quarter of the city. There is a Arab quarter of the city. There's a Jewish quarter of the city, and there's a Greek quarter of the city. Like, that's pretty obvious when you go to the city of Jerusalem. So we were interested in the Greek quarter because it's something that we didn't know that much about. We just wanted to see what else we could see there. Well, when you see this, you start to see why Russia would be interested in Jerusalem. See, that's the Church of Mary Magdalene. It sits just at the foot of the Mount of Olives, and it glimmers and shines in the light, just the way the temple or the mosque rather in Jerusalem does with its gold topping. So the Russians really do have a presence there. And this is something we would never have thought of, as that the former Soviet leaders would ever, desire to have the presence of religious leaders. But Putin, yes, very much so. You see many pictures of him like this, where he's associating himself with the Russian Orthodox Church. So when you go into Snippets files or into any of the news files that some of the brethren are generating for us, it's interesting just to see what they have to say. This comes out of the 21st of May, and it's based on an article in Forbes. When Putin came to power, it says, he shrewdly noted, that's the Russian Orthodox Church's useful role in boosting nationalism and the fact that it shared his view of Russia's role in the world, and began to work towards strengthening the church's role in Russian society. That never happened in the Soviet Union. So you can almost see that something had to happen in Russia to bring them this way. So early in his presidency, as I continue reading here, the Russian Duma passed a law returning all church property seized during the Soviet era, which alone made the ROC one of the largest landholders in Russia. Over the past decade and a half, Putin has ordered state-owned energy firms to contribute billions to the rebuilding of thousands of churches destroyed under the Soviets. And many of those rich oligarchs surrounding him are dedicated supporters of the ROC, who have contributed to the growing influence of the church in a myriad of ways. Around 25,000 Russian Orthodox churches have been built or rebuilt since the early 1990s, the vast majority of which have been built during Putin's rule and largely due to his backing and that of those in his close circle of supporters. So obviously Putin is pushing this. This is another little illustration of the same thing. And it goes on. It gets really quite intriguing as you see what he's up to. So this is a later version of Forbes. Vladimir Putin and Alexander Dugin. Now, you don't see too many other people associated with Putin. You almost think that this man runs the whole show himself. But this man, Alexander Dugin, is one of his advisors. And his vision of Holy Russia, which is shared with the Russian Orthodox Church, sees Russia's mission as being to expand its influence and authority until it dominates the Eurasian landmass by reason of a strong, centralized Russian state aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church, championing traditional social values over against the cultural corruption of a libertine West. Now that is just such an amazing turnaround for Russia. Seeing the West, seeing how the Christian values of the West are just plummeting, where many things that have been, the roots of Christianity are just being pulled out one after the other, Russia seems to want to champion them. And you can see that if you have a look at the news. And so he's winning over, he hopes, the various parts of Europe to bind them together with the help of the Russian Orthodox Church. So while all the things that he's doing with his military and all the threats that he's stating to the world about his military and what he could do if he wanted to, this is a side you don't see except you just read closely. The partnership between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church has been aimed not only at articulating this sacralized view of Russian national identity to the domestic audience, but also in advancing the mission of the Russian nation abroad. The manner in which the Russian state and the church has been cooperating, however, is undermining their jointly stated goal of building a Russian world that dominates Eurasia under Moscow's benign imperial oversight. So there's obviously things about it that people are wondering about, and that seems to be our world. It's not far off communist policy. You take 2 steps ahead and you back off one. You take 2 steps ahead and you back off one. Well, on that basis, you can be fooling people to what you're really doing, but you are advancing your initiative. So we see pictures like this, of this Christ the Saviour Cathedral in Moscow, this beautiful building that now illustrates Russia's new role in the world. And I don't suppose anybody would ever expected the Pope and the Russian leader to come together like this, but we have seen now that they seem to have some kind of a relationship, and to see Putin crossing himself with the Pope is just something just amazing. Now, in this article, which is Putin's Christian faith is central to his policies, I wanted to just note this. It says, and Putin gained firm support and endorsement from that inveterate and most intransigent anti-communist, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Before his death in 2008, Solzhenitsyn praised Putin and stated that he believed Putin's personal acceptance of Christian faith to be genuine. American Ambassador William Burns visited Solzhenitsyn in 2008, shortly prior to his death, and quoted him as saying that under Putin, the nation was rediscovering what it was to be Russian and Christian. And you just can note the article there. Just going on the next paragraph. Well, initially following the Yeltsin pro-American and pro-Western lead in foreign policy, Putin was also aware that Russia was undergoing a radical transition from a decrepit and collapsed communist state to the recovery of some of its older traditions, including a mushrooming, vibrant return to traditional Russian orthodoxy, a faith which he has publicly and personally embraced. You don't believe everything that you read in the news. We've learned that. Because in some cases you can read these things, even though they're filtered out by brethren, and you say, well, that's kind of interesting. That seems to be a new direction. And then find a few months later that the very opposite is being reported. I mean, people should not be gullible about the news at any time. That propaganda is one of the main instruments that people use to get their way, is to float an idea where people think this is what they're up to and then do something which may be almost opposite to it to actually achieve what they're trying to do. So whether there's anything in this about Russia or not, I don't know, but it would seem to me that he has a very crafty way in which he's dealing with Europe. That's probably the way we most often hear, is the European dependence on Russian energy. And I've seen maps and maps of pipelines going from Russia throughout all of Europe. And you just wonder, well, why would people have done this if they really have known Russia for what it is? Why would you make your nation dependent on Russian energy? And you never can forget that God says, I will do this. And when God does some things, many times its nations just seem to be silly, almost as if they weren't thinking or they didn't have their eyes open when they did something. But yeah, they're tied up with Russian energy. And this pipeline that we often hear about, the South Pipeline, and just can't be too sure where it's going, although I guess we can be a little more certain where it's not going. It's the top route there. You can just see on the diagram here, there's a route across here going into Bulgaria. And then the more recent route is this one here, this black route, which comes down and goes into Turkey first. And then notice, it goes across Greece and then across into Italy. So Russian energy coming from the south to go into Europe. There's a north pipeline, there's other pipelines, and then there is this south pipeline, because Russia seems to want to make sure that, well, they get their gas and their oil, but I would think more importantly that they're dependent on Russia. And just going back in the news a little while to see what Russia did to the Ukraine when Ukraine would not pay its bills, just turn off the spigot. If you turn off the spigot in the wintertime, that's almost a crime against humanity, because that just means a lot of people can't live. Now, I wanted to explain to you a little bit about this chart. This chart is our attempt in Ontario to try to bring charts back into circulation, but in the parks. And maybe you could see how you could do that in Melbourne. I don't know if you could do this in Melbourne. But that is a picture of a chart that's 12 feet wide. It'll be a little bit bigger than the screen you're looking at there, 8 feet high. And what it does is it focuses on flags. So that going through Ezekiel 38, if you look up the top right-hand corner up here, you'll notice the flag of Russia and Turkey and France and Germany, etc., as you go around. And there certainly could be others that we would put in there. And then you see the flag of Israel, and I can't quite see that. Oh, Egypt and Jordan. And then you have the flags down here of the United States and Australia, Britain, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. And then you have these ones out here, the Vatican, Europe, China, and United Nations. Now, if we didn't have anything other than those flags, and you said, oh, well, what we want is one brother to take a flag and to stand up in the park and take the flag from a flag stand, take it and put it in the front of the chart and tell the audience why you got that flag. Well, you got that flag because that nation, may not be directly, but that nation is mentioned in the Bible. It has a role to play in God's plan, and it couldn't have happened before Israel became a nation. Now, we've done this. We've done this several times, where we've gone into a public park. We had the chart. It's a big chart, so it has to be well established so it doesn't blow over. You get a wind, and that would blow around very easily. And then we have a flag stand with the flags in them, and then we just let brethren get up there and speak, and we have found that really attracted an audience, because people want to know why their flags, what's my flag here for? They come from some place in Europe, they want to know why that flag's there. Well, that's fine, that's where we wanted you to come. We want to show you why your flag's there. Just to get people interested in this. You see, prophecy never loses its relevance. This idea of Ezekiel 38 is just as current now as it ever was, maybe more current, because look at the nations that, well, Brother Stephen's going to tell us a little bit about the nations associated with the Ottoman Empire. And we've seen all these nations in North Africa. All of a sudden, they're all coming to life. And everything prophetically is coming to life, brothers and sisters. It's a wonderful time to get out there and tell people why we believe this chapter is relevant in our day. And if you have nations like up here and you say, well, all right, China's not mentioned, to be able to tell people, why isn't China mentioned? And that's an interesting thing in itself. Or what is the role of the United Nations? Like, why aren't they able to get peace in the world? Wasn't that the reason why they were established? And why is Europe uniting like this? And what role is the Vatican? Why did leaders of the world go to the Vatican? What would be the significance of that? We got the answers. And that gives us an in to the public of today. With all the other things that are going on, all the moral issues out there, you know, but you like to speak sometime, this is what God has given us to reach out to a world and tell them that the God of the Bible is very active in what he's doing. I'll leave that with you. We certainly could talk about that later afterwards. But look at them. And that's just a few, because I didn't take all the flags of Europe. We could certainly take more flags of some of the North African states. Mothers, if you have 50 brethren who want to go down to the park and each take a flag and stand up, well, I'm sure if there was 51 brethren, we could find another flag. And then, you see, you can separate them. And this is on a Bible prophecy that was written 2,500 years ago. Doesn't that illustrate the importance and significance of this book? That something that old could be that current, could be that up to date, that you could find those nations somewhere in that chapter or in the other chapters. That, I believe, brothers and sisters, is what God intended that our generation had, so we could tell people about the coming kingdom and attract them in these days as well. Well, just going back to one other issue I'd like to raise in the little bit of time we have left. Just trying to figure out a little bit about the Crimean War and how Russia went into the Crimea. I just noticed in Wikipedia, this is not necessarily something you would go to find very accurate information, but this is just one little clipping from that website on this topic. What was the cause of the Crimean War in 1853? It says the immediate issue involved the rights of Christians in the Holy Land, which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It involved the control of the holy sites in and around Jerusalem. Now, who would ever have thought you would fight a war in Crimea over that issue? The French promoted the rights of Catholics, while Russia promoted those of the Orthodox. And they still do. The longer-term causes involved the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the unwillingness of Britain and France to allow Russia to gain territory and power at the Ottoman expense. Russia lost, and the Ottomans gained a 20-year respite from Russian pressure. The Christians were granted a degree of official equality, and the Orthodox gained control of Christian churches in dispute. Russia survived, gained a new appreciation for its religious diversity, and launched a reform program with far-reaching consequences. But what I wanted to bring to your attention in quoting this was the idea of the holy sites in Jerusalem, because that's one of the big questions we have to answer, is why would Russia and Europe join to go down to Jerusalem? We're not really all that interested in Russia and Europe joining, but in joining to go down into Jerusalem. And these holy sites are still there and still really cause a lot of concern. So one of the things that Sister Dorothy and I did when we went to Israel is we wanted to find out what was in this place. Why would anybody fight over this place? The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. That's kind of interesting if you go underneath. If you go in this building, for instance, this new part of the building is Roman Catholic. But if you go to the old part of the building, it's Orthodox. It's Greek. So here you got a building where you got Greek and Orthodox, you got Russia and say Western Europe actually looking at this site and seeing this as an attractive place. Well, if you go down, if some of you probably have, there's a grotto. You go down underneath and there's this little tunnel. And this tunnel leads you to a place where you see a silver star on the floor. And the Greek Orthodox tell you, oh, that's where Jesus was born, right there. This is Bethlehem. And they claim that's where Jesus was born. This is the church floor was here, or at least the part where Jesus was born was right here. The church was built up, obviously, afterwards. However, having looked at that and say, well, that's kind of interesting. If you turn around, all you got to do is just turn around. Over here is a manger. And they have a little doll in the manger, and the Catholics say, but that's where Mary put him after he was born. Imagine that. Roman Catholics say, this is where the manger is, and the Greek Catholics say, but that's where he was born. They want to share the site. You would never think that that kind of thing goes on underground. But that's one of the reasons why these holy sites I think, are interesting to them. This site here, that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But I saw something there that I didn't see in Rome. We went to the Vatican. We went through that place just to see what was going on in there and what they were trying to attract people to. But in this site, when people came to the site, there was a stone. And I was amazed to see people falling down and kissing this stone. I saw them kissing an image in Rome, in the Vatican. There was this statue of Peter, and they were coming in, and some people were rubbing their hands over it, other people were kissing it. I thought, well, I don't know how these people live very long. But in this particular place, they were kissing a stone, because that apparently, in their mind, was the stone where Jesus' body was wrapped before he was put in the sepulcher. Now that's what goes on in these buildings, and you can see how that, however we think about them, and what we think they're, just a building waiting to come down. But for them, it's a holy site, and they're willing to go to war over these sites. And then if you go up to Nazareth, this is the big edifice that the Roman Catholic Church has built up there, called the Church of the Annunciation. Do you think these are important to these people? Well, the buildings tell you that they are, and that they would go to war over these buildings to contain or at least to control them. You can see how that all the nations of the world would be very unhappy that Israel has the oversight of these buildings, and how they would very much like to have that themselves. So the disarmament of Russia. Now I thought this was one thing, just there's two slides left. If you look at the ASV, you will notice that it says, and thou son of man, prophesy against Gog. This is Ezekiel 39. Say unto him, the Lord, well, this is ASV, so it uses Jehovah, which just illustrates where they are in their translation. Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn thee about, lead thee on, cause thee to come up from the uttermost parts of the north, and I will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. And I will smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and I will cause thine arrows to fall out of thy right hand. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, thou and all thy hordes, and the peoples that are with thee, and I will give thee unto the ravenous birds of every sort, and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. So whatever weapons this nation goes on to invent that they haven't thought of already, or however good their military might be, God says, I'll smite the weapons out of your hand. I'll cause your arrows to fall out of your right hand. There's no weapon formed against Israel that could ever prosper. So it's not a matter of fearing Russia. It's just a matter of seeing that these things will come to the end that the Bible has for them. Thou shalt fall upon the open field, for I have spoken, as saith the Lord Yahweh. So why will Russia and Europe come together? Their coming together is certain because the author of the Bible, who knows the future, states that it will happen. Yeah, that's where we rest our case. That's the foundation of our case, is that the Bible states it. That's what we think about the Bible. It states it that authoritatively that we can say that. To accomplish his purpose with his people of Israel, he will bring them together. So it's not as if God has a great purpose with Russia or with Europe, but it's with his people. And he will bring them together for that reason. Europe will have reason to invade the Middle East under Russian leadership. And we will await to see that if there's more things than we have noticed so far. And at some time, they will be attracted to Jerusalem to attempt to take control and to divide the spoil. But as we've seen the Word of God tell us, all nations will find Jerusalem a burdensome stone, especially those who rise up against her. So brothers and sisters, as we've looked at this introductory subject, it's ongoing, it's alive. We got a lot of things to look at, a lot of things to tell people and attract them to the God of this book because of how accurately he's been able to state this 2,500 years ago. Thank you.